Father, for being with us, for sending your great comforter, the Holy Spirit. Give us wisdom, insight into your word, discernment of every letter of your word, that we may gain in our understanding and come closer to you in the process, Father, as you increase our faith. In the name of the Son, Yeshua. Hallelujah. Welcome to the second part of session 4, study 4 of Knowing God. And I want to kick this off with a little bit of prophecy that's moving in real time. Ezekiel 38, the Gog and Magog war. I'm going to read from Ezekiel 38, 1 through 6. And the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Son of man, set thy face against Gog, the land of Magog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal, and prophesy against him, and say, Thus saith the Lord, Behold, I am against thee, O Gog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal. And I will turn thee back and put hooks into thy jaws, and I will bring thee forth, and all thine army, horses and horsemen, all of them clothed with all sorts of armor, even a great company with bucklers and shields, all of them handling swords. Persia, Ethiopia, and Libya with them, all of them with shield and helmet. Gomer and all his bands, the house of Togarmah of the north quarters, and all his bands, and many people with thee. We're going to get into Genesis 2, Garden of Eden. But just like last week, or the last session I should say, was we started off with some prophecy. This is where prophecy is unfolding in real time, and so I think it's important to cover some of these things, much more important than knowing where the Garden of Eden is located and certain details about the Garden of Eden. We're going to learn that soon enough. Right now, prophecy is unfolding. I want to get to that. I want to get to all that. It's incredibly interesting. But at the rate that prophecy is unfolding, we cannot afford to ignore details of prophecy. In this case, I'm referring to the war of Gog and Magog, Ezekiel 38 and 39. I want to read real quick before we get on to Genesis. I want to read real quick from Ezekiel 38, verses 1 through 6. And the word of the Lord came unto me, saying, Son of man, set thy face against Gog, the land of Magog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal, and prophesy against him, and say, Thus saith the Lord, Behold, I am against thee, O Gog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal. I will turn thee back and put hooks into thy jaws, and I will bring thee forth, and thine army, horses, horsemen, all of them clothed with all sorts of armor, even a great company with bucklers and shields, all of them handling swords. Persia, Ethiopia, Libya with them, all of them with shield and helmet. Gomer and all his bands, the house of Togarmah of the north quarters, and all his bands, and many people with thee. How we know this is prophecy? Because it hadn't happened yet. These are nations that are aligned against Israel, coming together at once. I'm going to explain. A lot of people think this is Armageddon. I don't think so. I think this is a pre-tribulation war, and I think that it's lining up very quickly to unfold. If we look at what's happening right now with Israel and the nations that are aligning themselves against Israel, this is coming together very quickly. So let's break down starting in verse 2. Son of man, I'm going to try to keep this short. I don't want to go into a tremendous amount of detail on this because I do want to get on with Genesis 2, but this takes priority. Prophecy is unfolding at a rate that we can't afford to ignore it. Son of man, Ezekiel that I know of, is the only other individual in the Bible referred to as a son of man. And this is God speaking directly to Ezekiel. Set thy face, of course, in a dream, a prophetic dream. Set thy face against Gog. Gog is an entity. Gog is not. The land of Magog is different from Gog. Gog is an entity, and probably could be demonic. Could be of a demonic nature. More than likely, it's fallen angel. It's of a higher rank. But could also be demonic. Very powerful demon. Land of Magog, we're going to look at in a minute, is what I believe is Russia. The chief prince of Meshech and Tubal. You see, God is speaking toward this entity, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal. Meshech and Tubal, by the way, we're going to get in. I hope I can eventually get around to it, but if we can, we're going to break down the regions eventually when we get past Noah and the flood. The earth was split up into three parts between the three sons of Noah. These are grandsons of Noah. Meshech and Tubal are grandsons through Japheth. It was Shem, Japheth, and Ham. Japheth or Japhet was these were two of his sons, and these are regions that were given to them that we learn from the book of Jubilees. And I hope we eventually get the time to get around to that. It's very important to know, because if you don't know that, which we wouldn't know if it weren't for Jubilees, we know that Meshech and Tubal are grandsons of Noah through his son Japhet, but without understanding how the earth was split in the book of Jubilees, you wouldn't know what this is referring to. So this is a region. Meshech and Tubal is a region. We'll look at the map. If you're watching the video, you'll see the map here, which is in the territory of Japhet is European and Eastern European and northern Middle Eastern countries. Russia, for example, definitely falls under that region. Thus saith the Lord, behold, I am against thee, O Gog, chief prince of Meshech and Tubal. I will turn thee back and put hooks into thy jaws, bring thee forth, all thine armies, horsemen. This is God provoking this war. God is provoking this war of Gog and Magog. This is not provoked by the fallen angel. This is God saying, you're going to war. And Persia, Ethiopia, and Libya. Persia is Iran. Ethiopia is a division of the land of Cush. Libya is also the land of Put. These are sons of Ham. Cush and Put were sons of Ham. So you're seeing again how these are divisions of the sons of Noah, Ham, Japhet, against the descendants of Shem, or the Shemites, Semites, Israelites. That's where the Semites get their name, as they're through the line of Shem, son of Noah. Gomer and all his bands, a house of Togarmah of the north quarters. Gomer is Eastern Europe, possibly also related to Russia. Togarmah that's going to be Turkey, Armenia. That's going to be that Turkish region. So when we're looking at this, we see these nations aligned, none of them even together. I mean, except for Russia, if we assume that Russia's Magog, none of them together are strong enough to come against Israel. But you throw Russia in there and it's a whole different ballgame. It's a different situation. And I don't think that, so what, we don't hear about Russia against Israel in the news, but there's something going on in the world of business and economics. Israel is sitting on, in their portion of the Mediterranean, one of the largest natural gas deposits in the world, and they I think it's estimated at 30 trillion cubic meters of gas. They're selling to Jordan, they're selling to Egypt, and they're negotiating with their own pipelines running into Europe, and this is in direct competition with Russia. Russia wants to control this. All of this fighting that's been going on in Syria for so long is over control of the pipeline. I believe it's called the Qatar pipeline, that was intended to rob Russia of a large portion of the European business for natural gas. Well, that's never materialized. Russia has been very successful in shutting that down. But here we go with Israel with their little piece of the natural gas business in the Mediterranean, which is huge, and they're negotiating. So this is an economic war that's really under the radar right now. You don't see Russia in the news lining up against Israel, but what I see happening is Russia involving themselves in a similar way as they have against the United States in various wars, where it's not really Russia per se, but it's Russia financing other nations and supporting them with money, weapons, bombs, etc., to go against. That's what I see happening here, is Russia going against Israel, taking advantage of this situation of all of these other countries that are lining up against Israel very quickly. Looks like about a total of around 7 nations lined up against Israel. This is happening in real time. We're watching this happen in real time. Turkey and Iran leading the charge. Libya, of course, following suit. When we say Iran, we're talking about Persia, where it refers to Persia here in the Bible. So in real time, we're looking at prophecy unfold. What's important to know about this is that it's going to be prior to the rapture, or I should say, the timing is about the same as the rapture. We're going to see this war before the rapture, but the timing is very close to the time of the rapture, because this is going to precede the tribulation, I believe. Let's get on with Genesis. I wanted to point this out. I hope you get a chance to look at these maps, how I've got this laid out here, but very, very important to pay attention to these developments in the news. Pay attention to not exactly what comes across the news, but some things that you're going to have to dig for, which is going to be Russia's involvement. You're not going to see that on the news. That's going to be filtered and kept out. Yeah, it could possibly make news, but I doubt it. So be on the lookout for Russia's involvement in this, and then you know that this is the war of Gog and Magog. That's how we're going to know it, is by Russia's involvement. Without seeing Russia involved in some way, it doesn't quite line up to prophecy yet. Where it lines up with prophecy, we're talking about Meshech and Tubal, the region of Japhet, sons of Japhet. This is how we know where that region is and who that prince is, whether he's angelic or demonic. It really doesn't matter. The fact is that he's incredibly powerful. And God is pitting this, God's provoking this war. And so this is how we know this is another sign of the end times, is this war, Gog and Magog. Let's pay close attention to this. I'm going to get on with Genesis now, but I wanted to throw this in there before we got started. Okay, so I'm very happy to get beyond my first part of Genesis 2, my conspiracy theories about the first and second man. I'm very happy to get past that. Now let's get on with my conspiracy theories about the Garden of Eden. I have worked actually pretty hard on this, and over a long period of time. These are some things that I suspected. One of the things that I do when I'm researching, when I'm looking for origins, if I find a word, especially in the Torah, especially in the books of Genesis through Deuteronomy, if I find a word that is not of Hebrew origin, then I start digging, because where did it come from? If this is God speaking to Moses, or the angel speaking to Moses on Mount Sinai, why would the word not be of Hebrew origin if we're going back to the beginning of things, where Hebrew being a language of sound and being the first spoken language, why would a word be in Genesis that is not of Hebrew origin? And that's the case with Eden. Let's read here Genesis 2 verses 9 through 14. And out of the ground made the Lord to grow every tree that is pleasant to the sight and good for food, the tree of life also in the midst of the garden, and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And a river went out of Eden to water the garden, and from thence it was parted and became into 4 heads. The name of the first is Pison, that is it which compasseth the whole land of Havilah, where there is gold. And the gold of that land is good. There is bdellium and the onyx stone. And the name of the second river is Gihon. The same is it that compasseth the whole land of Ethiopia. And the name of the third river is Hiddekel. That is it which goeth toward the east of Assyria. And the fourth is the Euphrates. All right, let's break this down. Going back to verse 8, and the Lord God planted a garden eastward in Eden, and there he put the man whom he had formed. I want to try to speed through this. I had already recorded this, and it got too long, so I'm starting over. Planted a garden. Let's take a look at that. Go into the Strong's. This word for garden is gan, and it refers to an enclosure. It's used as garden, but the root word ganan, or ganan, I guess it's pronounced, is in the 8 occurrences where it appears in the Bible, refers to a strong, like a fortress, a defense, more than an enclosure, which I find very interesting, because keep in mind, we're coming in here after this war in heaven, when Lucifer and his followers were cast down to the earth. So we don't really know what's going on at this time, but we can assume Lucifer's still in the picture, so this is not a peaceful situation. So I don't want to get too carried away, but this enclosure, this reference to an enclosure, means that it's in a place that's surrounded, making it, everything always occurs eastward in Eden. When Adam and Eve are cast out, they're cast out to the east. When the cherubim are put at the entrance of the enclosure, it's to the east. So the east is the only opening into this enclosure, and I believe that gives us a clue as to some mountain ranges that it's surrounded by. So let's take a look at, let's keep moving. Planted is the next one, and in Strong's, if you want to go to planted, it is to fix or establish. So I mean, we could also say, again, I'm not going to try to retranslate the King James Bible, but it is equally correct to say God established an enclosure eastward in Eden. That would be equally correct. So, I think it's just to get a better idea. But let's continue reading the rest of these few verses here. I also wanted to point out in this word gan for garden, this enclosure, in the 42, there's 42 occurrences of this word in the Bible. 20 of them are references to the Garden of Eden. The other 22, the majority, I would say, seem to want to describe like a courtyard. There's several references in Jeremiah and a few other places as Kings, the King's Garden, or it's almost as if it's referring to like a courtyard. So I think that also helps kind of draw a picture of this is not a compound, it's a courtyard, but a very, I would say, very secure courtyard. The reason probably this word enclosure is used is because the Most High God is there, and there's something going on here that we don't have a very clear picture of. This war in heaven, where Lucifer is obviously we'll see in a minute here how he disrupts God's plan. He's in the middle of things and he's a mess. So there's a reason that there would only be one entrance to the garden, and probably limited access to whatever other entities are living in Eden at this time. Anyhow, I just wanted to point that out real quick. So to continue, and out of the ground made the Lord God to grow every tree that is pleasant to the sight, good for food, the tree of life also in the midst of the garden, and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Of course, if this is still, if we're still talking about the conventional wisdom and the scholarly wisdom, is that this is still the days of creation. Adam comes along, and these trees already have fruit on them. Oh, God is extremely patient. So what's the rush? Why would he force things to be producing fruit after the third day? I don't know, but it's just another one of those things that doesn't make sense. There's a lot of time has lapsed between the days of creation and the days of that we're talking about here. But so on the tree of life, we know that is the fruit that extends life, gives life. Um, this was the taken away when Adam was restricted from access to this tree, when the cherubim was placed to the east, which we'll get to in a minute. That was the beginning of death. So his lack of access to this tree is what began the process of death. So this is something that interrupts the life cycle and perpetuates life. Whatever this fruit is, it perpetuates life, and whatever has access to it has eternal life. We eventually regain access to this tree. That's one of the gifts that we receive when we get out of this mess that we're in, is access to the tree of life. The tree of knowledge of good and evil. No pun intended, but I'm going to go out on a limb and say that this is something that offered a narcotic effect, was planted there to test them, to see if they could keep their hands off of it. They couldn't. But if you compare LSD, peyote, there's a lot of narcotics that people, when they're on them, they feel that they have this incredible wisdom, that they can see everything, that they know everything. LSD is one of those drugs that when people are on it, they feel like they're among the celestial beings. They feel as though they're one of them. We don't get a lot of details about this tree of knowledge of good and evil, but I'm going to say that that's what it was. It was the fruit of it offered a narcotic effect. Now, again, this is hypothetical. I could be wrong. I'm just using common sense, trying to evaluate the situation, knowing what our weaknesses are. We're all attracted to these narcotics. Humans, even the best of people are always, you want a sleeping pill, you want something that makes you feel good, we have the temptation is always to resist those things. So this was the first temptation, was this tree that was placed there, that whatever the effects of the fruit of it were, increased wisdom, made one wise. We'll see in a minute. We'll get into more details on that in a minute. Let's focus on Eden now. So here's where this is oh boy, I tell you, I really got stuck on this word. When I first discovered that Eden was, you could make it a Hebrew word, but it was a little bit of a stretch, that it was actually an Akkadian word, an ancient Sumerian Babylonian word for plains. And then we discover that a couple of these rivers, or the names are changed of them, to make us think that they are coming out of the Mesopotamia. Became this is a conspiracy. This is not a theory. It is a conspiracy. So let's look at a few of those details. So looking at Strong's, Eden, the garden home of Adam and Eve. Transliteration, Eden, phonetic spelling, Aden, Aden, and its word origin from an unused word. This is where I got real suspect, and I tell you, sometimes it looks to me like whoever's involved in this manipulation of Strong's Concordance, I'm using the online edition here. I have a hard copy edition that in a lot of these cases doesn't match the online edition. And I have to go to the hard copy sometimes to dig into further research, because they don't match. In this case, this is one of those cases. Eden is actually, there is a Hebrew word, phonetically, Edhen, I believe it's pronounced, that it refers to delightful, luxurious pleasure, and that actually fits. Well, why isn't that in here? Well, because it's not. They're using the phonetic spelling. It's almost like they're trying to lead us to this Aden, which is a Babylonian word for plains. So, it's almost, in this case, makes me believe that Strong's is in on this conspiracy. They're trying to lead us away from knowing the truth about this. So, I tell you what, let's continue. I want to get into what Eden actually is according to the book of Jubilees, and then we'll continue looking at this. But okay, so we're supposed to be using the Hebrew language, and the word origin is from an unused word. In other words, it doesn't appear anywhere else in history except right here. It tells you there's something wrong, unless someone's failed to clarify. An angel failed to clarify that this was not a Hebrew word at all. That it was a word like Yahweh. Something that was just related specifically to God and had another origin outside of this world. But no, that's not the case. It's just they leave us kind of in limbo, pointing towards Babylon always, and this is what we have to be suspect of and watch. So let's continue looking at this, but be advised, this is where a little bit of deception begins. They're trying to take us to Babylon. I'm going to read from there's another resource I use. There's a number of resources, but I try to zero in on the ones that give us the best information. One of these is a resource you can find online called Abarim, A-B-A-R-I-M Publications. I'm going to read to you. I've put it on the slide here on the video. Eden meaning, go into a BDB Theological Dictionary and HAW Theological Word Book of the Old Testament. Nevertheless, claim the name Eden from the Akkadian word Edenu, based on the Sumerian word Eden, meaning plain or steppe. This is pushing us to this location between the Euphrates and the Tigris, which is Babylon. Whatever the original name giver meant to say with the name Eden is unclear, but any Hebrew audience, this is important, would have heard a meaning of delight or luxury. For a meaning of the name Eden, the NOBSE Study Bible name list reads delight, pleasantness. Jones Dictionary of Old Testament proper names renders paradise a place of delight. In Greek, which this is the word used in the Septuagint that came from the Hebrew. In Greek, this name exists as Tryphosa. Tryphosa goes right back to exactly this place of luxury. Paradise or place of luxury. So this draws a better picture of what Eden, the name Eden, really means. They're trying to push us toward this Sumerian word Aden, pushing this location into, I want to get in a little bit further into this. I want to get into who's behind this. It is the same old Pharisees that have been behind everything else, the seed of Satan. That's who's been behind this. This misleading information. Anyway, so Eden is a place of luxury. I want to read to you from Abarim Publications. I'm going to read this. I don't think I'm going to post it on the video. The name Eden occurs 3 times in the Bible. The first and most famous Eden relates to the location of the paradisal garden in which Adam and Eve lived their pre-fall existence. We know that. That's what we're reading about. Which actually was east of Eden, which we said. Marked by 4 rivers, Pishon, Gihon, Hiddekel, and Parat. That Parat is the Euphrates that we read in I believe it was verse 9. The second Eden is either a person or a region somewhere in Mesopotamia. Prophet Isaiah speaks of sons of Eden. They go on to talk about various other uses of the word Eden. Of course, we note that Eden was applied in retrospect, unless we assume God named the place Eden. We don't exactly know where Eden was. We're going to get to that. I think we know exactly where it is. The description of the location of the rivers is also not very revealing. The Pishon flows in the land of Havilah, which is, according to Genesis 25:18, somewhere between Egypt and Assyria. Okay, hold on right there. Hold on right there. We're going to get to that. Genesis 25:18, and they dwelt from Havilah unto Shur, that is before Egypt, as thou goest toward Assyria, and he died in the presence of all his brethren. This is talking about Abraham's descendants on the side of Hagar, not his wife Sarah, but from the handmaid that was given to him in Egypt, which is, we'll get to that story, hopefully, eventually. This was Ishmael and the descendants of Ishmael. Anyway, this is the chronology of the line of Ishmael, and they're using this land of Havilah. They're saying as you go unto Ashur toward Egypt. This is, in order to understand this, we have to go to the Table of Nations and understand where this Havilah comes from. Table of Nations, Genesis chapter 10. Let's start, so we know where we're going with this. Let's start with, this is the line of Shem. They're discussing the Table of Nations. This is Shem in the Table of Nations, verse 25. And unto Eber were born two sons. The name of one was Peleg, for in his days was the earth divided, and his brother's name was Joktan. This is very important. In his days the earth was divided. Verse 29, and Ophir and Havilah and Jobab, all these were the sons of Joktan. I believe this, not to change the subject, but I believe this Jobab is Job. Havilah, this is the land of Havilah named after the sons of Joktan, who were in the line of Shem through Eber. This is like saying San Antonio. I mean, how many San Antonios are there? Right? Not that there are that many Havilahs, but this is not the land of Havilah. This is Havilah, named after one of the sons of Joktan. So they really got, I mean, I don't know why they even call themselves scholars, because if I can do this, anybody can do this. This has nothing to do with the land of Havilah. Let's go back to, I want to get back to to Eden here. Let's go back to verse 10. And a river went out of Eden to water the garden, and from thence it was parted and became into four heads. The name of the first is Pison, that is it which compasseth the whole land of Havilah, where there is gold. And the gold of that land is good. There is bdellium, the onyx stone, and the name of the second river Gihon. Okay, let's focus on this land of Havilah, because it's eventually, this takes us to the Garden of Eden, the enclosure, the courtyard, the luxurious paradisal courtyard of Eden. That's this land of Havilah. I want to get to, let me see here, that's the best way to go about this. I think, let's jump into, before we get into the rivers, let's jump into what I believe Eden is, and then let's go back to the rivers. Trying to condense this into a shorter journey than the one that I took to get here. I want to read from the book of Jubilees. If I've lost people that don't want to read out of the Old Testament, I've really lost them that don't want to read out of anything except the Bible. The book of Jubilees is full of good information. Whether it's inspired word or not, I'm not able to determine that. But what I know is that the information that it gives is accurate. Let's look at Jubilees. It's going to be 8 verses 12 through 20. And it turns from, they're talking about the rivers and the divisions of the earth of the sons of Noah, using the rivers to determine the divisions of the earth. These are the same rivers that are described in Genesis chapter 2. And it turns from here towards the south, towards the mouth of the great sea on the shore of its waters, and extends to the west to Afra, and it extends till it reaches the waters of the river Gihon. And to the south of the waters of Gihon, to the banks of this river, and it extends towards the east till it reaches the Garden of Eden. So here we go again. This is east, far east. To the south thereof, to the south, and from the east of the whole land of Eden, of the whole east, it turns to the east and proceeds till it reaches the east of the mountain named Rapha, and descends to the bank of the mouth of the river Tina. This portion came forth by lot for Shem and his sons, that they should possess it forever unto his generations forevermore. And Noah rejoiced that this portion came forth for Shem and for his sons, and he remembered all that he had spoken with his mouth in prophecy, for he had said, Blessed be the Lord God of Shem, and may the Lord dwell in the dwelling of Shem. And he knew that the Garden of Eden is the Holy of Holies, the dwelling place of the Lord, and Mount Sinai, the center of the desert. This is another holy place of the Lord, and Mount Zion, the center of the navel of the earth, another holy place of the Lord. These three were created as holy places facing each other. All right. So here's what I think is if we understand Mount Zion, the center of the navel of the earth. We know where Mount Sinai is. It's not in Egypt. It's not where the tourist attraction is located. We know that much. It is in Arabia, Saudi Arabia. The Garden of Eden is a holy place. Mount Zion, a holy place. Let's look at what I think Mount Zion is, because I believe it leads us to understand Eden, and that Eden is the whole earth. The Garden of Eden being east of the whole earth. Mount Zion being the center of the navel of the earth. Let's take a look at what I think Mount Zion is. This is pretty important. When I was researching the magnetosphere of the earth and trying to understand this electromagnetic relationship between the sun and the earth, I came across this photo, this image of the magnetosphere and the electromagnetic field that encompasses the earth, and the electromagnetic vortex that is centered directly over the North Pole. And it became immediately abundantly clear to me that this was the center of the navel of the earth. See, we're always trying to boil things down into a way that we can understand them, when really we should be expanding our minds to be able to understand things from a perspective that God, not that we can understand a lot of this, but that we should try to understand the way God sees things. And this is the center of the navel of the earth, and I have a suspicion that this was the way that travel to and from Earth among celestial beings was done. I think they entered through this polar vortex, or this electromagnetic vortex, which is at the North Pole. If you look at this, it's obvious that this is a navel. This is a center of the navel of the earth, is the electromagnetic vortex of the magnetosphere, which encompasses the earth. So let's look at that, and then let's take a look at this United Nations logo, which I wonder if they know how much they know that we don't know, how much information is kept from us, because it certainly looks to me like they went back in time to create that logo. But let's take a look at that. So in this One World Government, New World Order, United Nations logo, you can see that I think I'm going to venture to say that wherever God resides, when he looks down on the earth, this is what he sees. And wherever this logo came from, these people know that. And they're duplicating the God syndrome, trying to duplicate they've got a God syndrome. They've got, they have an agenda, New World Order agenda. Anyway, that's really neither here nor there. It's just interesting that they chose this as their logo, and from it, kind of thankful that they did, because it's where we can generate. If you take a look at that on the next slide, the center of the navel of the Earth is definitely the North Pole. So Eden is going to be east from there. And where they're telling us Eden is, where they want us to believe Eden is south of there, southeast. Almost due south, actually. So I'm going to stick with this. I think this leads us closer and closer to where we want to get to, in understanding where Eden is for people that are a little bit loco like myself and can't give up on these things and want to know. I think this takes us to Eden. This gets us closer and closer, one step at a time. The rivers are going to get us there. So let's get through this and get onto the rivers. But I wanted you to see this, and trying to take you down the same highway that I went down to get there. So it's I'm just going to try to make it a shorter trip. All right, so take a look at this. This is Google Earth looking down on the Earth, with the Earth positioned exactly the same as it is in the UN logo. And where I've got this circled there would be the navel of the Earth. And let's zoom in on that. That would be the navel of the Earth according to this electromagnetic polar vortex in the magnetosphere, or the electromagnetic field of the Earth. This would be the navel of the Earth right here, the North Pole. Let's zoom in on that, and something very interesting occurs. When we zoom in on this using Google Earth, this is where the mid-Atlantic ridge begins in the system of oceanic trenches. This is the shallowest at the top of the Earth, and of course it runs downhill. And I believe that when we take into consideration, we have to go back, these are pre-flood times. The Earth was only 15% water according to Esdras at that time. We know that that's probably accurate because this is before the flood. The flood is after the flood, we're 70% water. This was the river system of Eden at the time, and I believe the North Pole is Eden. This navel of the Earth is Eden. And out of Eden, let's take a look, let's go back to the scripture. And the river went out of Eden to water the garden, and from thence it was parted and became into four heads. This is Eden. This navel of the Earth is Eden. Not the Garden of Eden. This is Eden. There's a big difference. Eden is to the east of Eden. The river went out of Eden to water the garden, and from thence it parted and became into four heads. So let's take a look at this oceanic ridge system. There's a change. They have an average depth, and then there's changes in elevation that work to a point of the deepest trench, which is the Mariana Trench. That is where this system ends. And I don't know how the water circulates and gets back to the top of the Earth, but I'm sure it has something to do with the moon, this electromagnetic field, the magnetosphere. All of those things interact together. The orbit of the Earth, the gravitational pull, all of these things have an effect. I don't understand that, but the water that waters this garden ends up recirculating over and over and over, spewing back out from Eden to continue watering the garden. So let's take a look at this oceanic trench system. So the mid-Atlantic ridge oceanic trench system begins at the North Pole. That is the shallowest of the oceanic trenches. And basically, if you look at a tectonic plate map, which I have placed here in the video, these are basically where the rivers run. So you see the main head coming down from the North Pole, and then it branches off You have tectonic plate going around Africa, all the tectonic plates. This is basically the way the oceanic trench system runs. I've got it here in another slide where you can actually see the rivers that we're discussing. I've got the rivers labeled. So this, the Pison being the first, I think in Hebrew we're reading from right to left. I'm not sure if that's why they've got it this way, or why it's written that way when actually it's to the east. But you can see where I've got these, the Gihon, even up into the 1800s, this was known from about Central Africa north, was known as the land of Ethiopia, not the little tiny country of today. So this oceanic trench that surrounds Africa being the Gihon, the Hiddekel being the river that comes out east of Africa, east of Assyria, it says. The Parat, the word Parat, I believe, I don't recall, I'm going to look it up here in a minute, but I believe it was fruitful and abundant, or fruitful, productive, something of that nature. Euphrates was good abundance or good fruit. Good fruitful abundance was the name of, is the root of that Euphrates. So it comes from Parat, and this, where it says Euphrates in the King James, is actually the Parat River. That's where that word Euphrates comes from. So they've taken that word and placed it in the Middle East, where we know the Euphrates River today to be, but actually we have to go back in time when there was no ocean on the earth, only these 15% of the earth covered in water. These oceanic ridges, oceanic trenches that encircle the earth were the river system. The main branch coming down from Eden, breaking into 4 heads. So there's a total of 5 rivers that engulf the planet, that recirculate around the planet. I don't know exactly how they do that, but they do that. And this map here is basically it. I've got one more map I want to share with you. So here you can see a little better how these rivers flow coming down from Eden, where the Pison ends at the Mariana Trench. This is the mid-ocean ridge system, and these have to be the rivers that are being discussed in Genesis, not these little streams that they're trying to lead us to believe. Two of them coming out of the Middle East. It just, again, these things just don't make sense. You've got to go back from before the flood. Look at the earth before the flood. We know these things now today. We know where these trenches, these mid-ocean trench systems are, and how they interconnect. And this is the river system from Eden. Eden being the North Pole. This is where the water sprouts from. And also, by the way, remember that the navel of the earth was Mount Zion. Mount Zion is Eden. This was a holy place of the Lord, the holy place of Yahweh, Yahuwah. One of the 3 holy places on the earth, the Garden of Eden, Mount Sinai, and Mount Zion, which is Eden. So here we go. If we get back to this UN logo world map, looking down at the navel of the earth, the Garden of Eden is to the east. The farthest point east happens to coincide perfectly with the Mariana Trench. And what is next to the Mariana Trench is the Philippine Trench. So just in reasonable deduction, working through this, we start to point towards the Philippines as having been the Garden of Eden. So let's take a look at a couple of other things to see where this leads. So take a look at these. This is where all of the rivers terminate, is in the Mariana Trench from both directions. Coming from the Parat, what I believe to be the Parat River, circulates through the Tonga Trench and then into the Philippine Trench and then the Mariana Trench coming from the north is the deepest point. So this is where all the rivers terminate, and this is why I'm going to get to why I think this is the Pison River, and the land of Havilah is surrounded by the Pison River. First of all, I think in Hebrew they're reading from right to left. So this, well, I don't know about that. I mean, I know that's what they do, but I don't know if that's why they started with the Pison when the Pison is actually where this ends. The Pison River is actually where this terminates. But let's take a look. Okay, so from here, I want to go into why I believe this is the Pison River and the land of Havilah, and why the land of Havilah is this area. We have to, right now we're looking at the ocean, but there was no ocean here. This was land. These were rivers and this was land. Right now we're circling a little spot in the ocean, but this was actually land. So let's zoom in on this, and then I want to get to why I think this is the land of Havilah and the Garden of Eden. One of my old bosses used to say, "Mark, please," he would stop me because I would go into so many details, 500 words or less. I don't have all day. And I started laughing at myself because there's just almost no way to get through this without going through these details. So let's look at Eve. Eve comes, we say Eve, but it's actually Hava. And this land of Havilah comes from Hava. Havilah is the land of Eve. Strong's Concordance is life giver, to live by implication, intensively. In other words, live to the fullest. And it also, I've read where it also relates to bringing forth, to bring forth, and especially because, you know, Eve was cursed after this fall. We'll take a look at it here in a little while, but to bring forth in pain. But anyway, so Havilah is the land of Eve. So little by little we keep getting there. But to look at these rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates are a total deception. These are two rivers that spring from snow melts. These are not interconnected rivers that circle the globe. They run for a short distance into the ocean, which terminates in a trench. So there's just no way that these rivers could be it. If we look at the earth the way that it was before the flood, only 15% water, and how these subduction zones which form the oceanic trenches today had to have been the river systems. Obviously they're the lowest points on earth. They held water. There was no ocean. Those were river systems. There's just no way to get there with the Tigris and Euphrates, where we conventionally believe that they are today. The Euphrates is a term that, there's a Euphrates River in the Middle East, but the word Euphrates being abundantly good and fruitful, well, that's all that is a definition of what this river does. And if you look at where the river flows towards the most productive, it connects to each of the most productive areas of the planet. I think it makes perfect sense that it would be named as such. When we get to the clues of Havilah, the gold of that land is good. There is bdellium and the onyx stone. When I looked at bdellium, or bdellium, however it's pronounced, bedolach, I believe it was in Hebrew, is they're constantly taking it back to this resin gum that is mostly produced in Africa, and it just doesn't fit. It doesn't fit this whole gold and onyx, and then this resin gum. Resin gum just doesn't blend in with gold and onyx. These should be three different stones, or metals, or precious metals, or precious stones. So what is bdellium? So when you look it up, I'm trying to get through this, so I'm not going to put this on the screen. But if you go to Strong's Concordance, they take you to gum resin. So I did some research, and I found where in the Septuagint, in the book of Numbers, they're comparing the manna to this beautiful crystalline stone called bdellium. I found that very interesting because it doesn't fit the rest of the translations. And in Strong's Concordance, they say of dubious origin and say that it's probably Sanskrit, and then everything takes you to this gum resin. So I didn't buy it. As I said, anytime I stump on a word that says no origin, and we're supposed to be, I mean, this is obviously given to Moses in a language that he understood. They wouldn't be speaking to Moses in Sanskrit if he didn't speak Sanskrit. Come on, you know. So here's what I believe bdellium is. I found in the Jewish Encyclopedia that it is probably referring to pearls. Of course, they want to take you back to the Arabian coast. You know, everything's always trying to drag us, no matter what it is. They want to drag us back to Babylon. So they believe that this is pearl, but I want to show you something that I believe is much more concrete proof of where this bdellium comes from. And I believe it is pearl and not some gum resin out of a tree. From the Associated Press, Manila, Philippines, a Filipino fisherman in western Palawan Island has found possibly the world's largest pearl, but he didn't know it. For 10 years, the 75-pound pearl was hidden in a bag under his bed. The fisherman's family would rub it with their hands before going out to sea in the belief it would bring them luck. Amarao is his name, who is also Puerto Princesa City's tourism officer, said Thursday that the man gave her the pearl last month for safekeeping because he was moving to a new place. So the largest, and actually if you do a little research, you'll find that all of the largest pearls in the world have come from the Philippines and not the Arabian coast. In fact, a pearl is very difficult to even find on the Arabian coast. Then if you search onyx, you'll find that the Philippines are one of the largest suppliers of the finest onyx in the world. The Philippines is also one of the largest sources of gold in the world, one of the richest sources of gold, which is what actually leads us. The strongest evidence that I would say that we have of all the evidence that I have presented so far, which most people are going to consider a little bit shady. I firmly believe in my heart that this is the Garden of Eden. I've got a picture here I'm going to put up in a minute on the video, but I want to tell you first, there was a book written by Charles Knoll, published in 1962, called Magellan's Voyage Around the World. I bought the book and I've read it, and it is incredibly interesting, but what is most interesting is to find out that when Christopher Columbus set sail, he was headed to the east, not to the west. The route to the east, they believed, was going to be shorter, cutting across from the west with what they knew of the world at that time. And when he came to the Caribbean and found what we call America today, he believed that he had found Solomon's treasure. King Solomon and Hiram of Tyre, the navy of Hiram of Tyre, were bringing, when Solomon built the temple, were bringing onyx and gold and probably bdellium. It doesn't mention it, but I wouldn't doubt it, from Tarshish and Ophir. And so Columbus was looking for Solomon's treasure of Tarshish and Ophir. When he believed that he had found it, he actually died with the knowledge that he did not. And Ferdinand Magellan comes into the picture, and in a contract with, to make this a short story because it's actually a pretty long story, and I've already made this a long story. In a contract with King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain, set sail looking for what Christopher Columbus did not find, which was the Isles of Tarshish and Ophir mentioned in the Bible, which was the source of Solomon's gold, the source of Israel's wealth at that time. Magellan finally found it, and it was the Philippines. In Magellan's writings, he mentions that tribal chiefs were wearing chunks of gold the size of his fist around their necks. This was an incredibly rich land loaded with gold, and Ferdinand Magellan finally found the Isles of Tarshish and Ophir, which was the Philippine Islands, and that is actually where he died, on the island of Cebu, I believe it was, in the Philippines. That's where Magellan died. So that's a little piece of history that we don't know. Solomon Islands were named by the Spanish in eventual subsequent trips there. Of course, this was during the expansionism years, and the Solomon Islands were named as a deception to keep the rest of the world from knowing that the Philippines were the actual source of King Solomon's wealth. It was a deception. And whether or not, I believe they were named by the Spanish. I think they were called Islas Salomon, but then they were all complicit in this deception. So Solomon Islands were never the Isles of Tarshish and Ophir. They were always the Philippines, and Magellan knew that when he died. Now there's many other connections, but I think I want to cut it off here. I believe some of the lost tribes ended up in the Philippines, and that the Philippines will eventually be brought in as God's people here in the end. When the tribes come together, many of them are going to be coming from the Philippines. Now that may be a bit of a stretch, but I believe that many of the tribes left. Not all of them were captured in northern Syria, where we believe the Kurds are today. I believe that many of these lost tribes went to the Philippines on these same routes that Solomon and Hiram of Tyre took. They departed, I believe, out of the Red Sea, the port of the Red Sea. And it was, of course, a very long journey. It was a couple of years. This is where the Queen of Sheba came from to visit Solomon, and possibly how he knew. I also believe it's where the wise men came from that traveled for 2 years to see the baby Messiah. They followed the star for 2 years. Any journey across the Middle East can be done by camel to Jerusalem from the farthest point in about 90 days. These guys traveled for 2 years to get there. They came by sea, and only a few months by land. So, Queen of Sheba, the wise men, this was the original location of the Garden of Eden. It is submerged in water now, and let's take a look at where I believe it is. This area west of the Philippines, southwest of the Philippines in the Sulu Sea, makes the most sense. And I've found a few things. First of all, if you look at this as an enclosure, the depth around these islands in the center of the Sulu Sea ranges from 6,000 to 15,000 feet all the way around it. So there's these mountains that rise up as a peak up. Today it rises up out of the ocean, but at that time I believe it was a trough of water in the bottom. And today is very deep, but that back then was probably just a river at the bottom of this what are islands today. But today it runs pretty deep. It's about 15,000, ranges from 6,000 to 15,000 feet below sea level. But what drew my attention was not that. I started looking for this after I found this island it's actually a volcano to the east. Remember, well, we haven't gotten to it yet. We're trying to get to it, but Adam and Eve were cast out to the east, and the cherubim was placed at the entrance of the enclosure. We're going to use that word instead of garden. Entrance of the enclosure to prevent anything else from coming in. And there's a volcano to the east. There's a number of islands in the Philippines that are phonetically Hebrew. They're, of course, they're in the native language of I don't know, I forget what it is, Talawag or something like that. But the phonetic, if you say the word, it's phonetically Hebrew, even though it's spelled differently. There's an island there named Hibuk, which in Hebrew phonetically is shame, shame, and it is directly to the east of this enclosure. When I began looking at the Philippines as this possible location of the Garden of Eden, I tried to look for this enclosure to see what made the most sense. This makes the most sense. You can see where at the entrance, sea level drops all the way. The water's only a few feet deep in that range coming out. So this is a really deep trough around this peak that comes back up to sea level, just to the west of Mount Hibuk, which is phonetically shame, shame in Hebrew. So, and there's some legends there actually in the Philippines that this was the ancient home of Adam and Eve. There are people in the Philippines, ancient tribes of people actually that still believe this today. You know, it's very hard to find this information. It's almost totally obscured, even from the internet. But if you dig long enough and hard enough, you find these things. I could be totally wrong about this. It could all be something else. But when I was looking for this enclosure, take the oceans away. Imagine what it would look like without water. Wow, this is an enclosure. And in this tropical place, I can only imagine how beautiful it might have been at that time. Well, even today, it's one of the most beautiful places in the world. In fact, the Philippines have been declared the most biologically diverse islands or lands in the world. There's more fish, more marine life, more wildlife than anywhere else in the world. So looks like a good spot for the center of creation compared to a desert with two skinny rivers flowing from snow-covered peaks. I mean, come on. Nothing about that makes sense, and there's no enclosure around a flat desert. So again, getting into when we dig into the original Hebrew, we start to learn a lot that we've missed through translations and what I believe are some deceptions in those translations. So let's look at what they want us to believe is the location, I should say, of the Garden of Eden. I posted this first one just because it was laughable. There are so many things wrong with this. Havilah, of course, where they're saying the Garden of Eden, but the land of Cush, I mean, it's on the wrong side of the Tigris to be the land of Cush. It's just laughable. The land of Nod, of course, eventually we're going to get to that. I think the Solomon Islands were the land of Nod, where Cain was cast to the east. Those would be the next lands to the east of the Philippines. I think that's where Cain was sent. But anyway, this is just laughable, absolutely laughable. The conventional wisdom would have us believe that this area around Basra, Iraq, was formerly the Garden of Eden. I was searching for some photos to see if I could post them here, anything that would look similar to the Garden of Eden, and a little bit of water, a few palm trees, lots of tanks and smoke and bombs. I couldn't find anything that looked anything remotely similar to Garden of Eden. And of course, does this area around Turkey look like the navel of the center of the earth? I don't think so. I mean, if this is where the water flows down from Eden to get to the garden, which is east of Eden, this is south of what they're saying would be the proposed center of the navel of the center of the earth. I mean, of course, they're not using jubilees either. The scholars Even digging into the Bible, you know that this would not be the land of Havilah. This would not be, without going into any other books outside of the King James Bible, you could not in any way determine that this would be the land of Havilah. In no way whatsoever. So, anyway, this is what they want us to believe. They're trying to force us. So eventually, when we get to chapter 6 through 8, I want to talk about where the proposed location of Noah's Ark is in Turkey on Mount Ararat. I believe we're going to eventually find out. When I saw the Discovery on the History Channel, or just actually the History Channel, I'm sorry, was or maybe it was Discovery, one of them, saying that this was definitely Noah's Ark. I was like, oh, okay. Here comes another, disinformation campaign. So what are they trying to hide? I think what we're going to end up finding out is, we get to chapter 6, we'll explain more about it, but I think what we're going to end up finding out is this point in Mount Ararat where they believe that Noah's Ark is sitting is how the hybrids that were, at least one or maybe a couple of hybrids, made it across the flood. I know that it says all flesh was destroyed, but I think we're going to find out that that ark was not Noah's. And there's already a few things I've noticed that don't fit the description. For example, Noah's ark was pitched within and without. It was covered with pitch, and I think that was to preserve it. This ark that they found, every wood bit of wood that's exposed, there's no pitch on it. So yeah, I think we're going to find that's a deception. I know it's a deception. I just can't prove it yet, except when we get into that part of the story, we find that from where Noah actually landed, as people repopulated the earth, they were constantly migrating west from the east, and Mount Ararat is north of where these areas that were supposedly first settled. So anyway, I don't want to get into that. This has been incredibly long. I hope you've made it this far. Let me see if there's anything else that I wanted to finish up here. So let's summarize all of this. I'm going to try to do this short. So Eden is this navel of the center of the earth. It is where this watering of the garden begins, where it parts and splits into four heads. The name of the first is a Pison. That is it which compasseth the whole land of Havilah, where there is gold, bdellium, and onyx. I believe that bdellium is not a resin gum. I don't know what use that would have been to anyone or any value, so why would something basically worthless be put in here as something valuable? I think bdellium is the pearl, as we are able to detect from the Septuagint translation in the book of Numbers. I believe it's 11 verse 7. The gold, of course, is incredibly plentiful in this land of Havilah that I propose is the Philippines. Onyx stone is extremely plentiful, and if we look at how the Pison encompasses the land of Havilah, it definitely matches. If we understand that these oceanic trenches form the ancient river system before the flood, the deepest trench being the end of the system is the Mariana Trench, and right there at the Mariana Trench, this land of Havilah, discovered by Magellan, that was the source of King Solomon's wealth, was discovered and matches what I believe to be perfectly this Pison River, encompassing the whole land of Havilah. This land of Havilah being the land of Eve, where the Garden of Eden was located. This Hibbuk to the east of what I believe very well could have been the location of the enclosure of the Garden of Eden. The ancient Philippine legends that this was the home of Adam and Eve. There's just a lot of things. Of course, then we know Magellan's journey that led him to his death, but he proved that the Philippines were the source Solomon's wealth, Israel's wealth at the time of Solomon. All of these things point to, I should say, point away from this deception that Babylon is in the Middle East and that our origins are there. That's just an absolute blatant lie that I hope that at the end of this hour and 15 minutes I have been able to disprove. I really hope you found this useful, helpful, informative, and may you be blessed by this information as I have been. And I'm ready to move on to the rest of it. We haven't even finished chapter 2. This is an embarrassment. I wish I could shrink these down. I haven't even finished chapter 2, but let's get on with the rest of chapter 2 in the next episode. And thank you, Father, for being with us in this. Hallelujah.
I was ashamed of myself, the lies I believed. They got some roots, they run deep. I let them take a hold of my life. I let them take control of my life. Standing in your presence, Lord, I can feel you digging all the roots up. I feel you healing all my wounds up. All I can say is hallelujah. Look what you've done. Look what you've done in me. You spoke your truth into the lies I let my heart believe. Look at me now. Look how you made me new. The enemy did everything that he could do. Oh, but look what you've done. Suddenly all the shame is gone. I thought I was too broken, now I see you were breaking new ground inside of me. Standing in your presence, Lord, I can feel you digging all my roots up. I feel you healing all my wounds up. All I can say is hallelujah. Look what you've done. Look what you've done in me. You spoke your truth into the lies I let my heart believe. Look at me now. Look how you made me new. Oh, the enemy did everything that he could do. Oh, but look what you've done. On the cross, in a grave, with a stone rolled away. All my debt, it was paid. Look what you've done. In my heart, in my mind, in my soul, in my life. With my hands lifted high, I'm singing. Look what you've done. Look what you've done in me. You spoke your truth into the lies I let my heart believe. Look at me now. Look how you made me new. Oh, the enemy did everything that he could do. Oh, but look what you've done. On a cross, in a grave, with a stone rolled away. All my debt, it was paid. Look what you've done. In my heart, in my mind, in my soul, in my life. With my hands lifted high, I'm singing. Look what you've done.